Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're patching in from, and welcome to our third and final launch event for our white paper series on alternative regulatory responses to misinformation. My name is Michael Nicholas. I'm the Wikimedia Fellow at Yale ISP, where I lead the initiative on intermediaries and information. Much of the motivation for developing this series lies in the need to try and push back against the growing trend of governments imposing criminal content restrictions against the spread of misinformation or false information or fake news. Since 2016, that's a trend of problematic legislation that we've seen, and it's grown significantly over the past year with the pandemic, leading to predictable abuses against as these laws are repurposed to target journalists, civil society, opposition figures, what have you. So that was a main driver behind the development of this paper series. And if we don't want governments to be playing that role, it's inescapable that we need the platforms to be doing a better job as stewards of the public discourse. And that poses a fundamental challenge, given the way that imperative and the values around human rights, the public interest, can conflict with the core profit motive. That's a really difficult issue to address, but today's paper is going to focus on that and to explore avenues in that direction in terms of corporate governance reforms, which are intended to promote the incorporation of human rights standards and a greater emphasis on human rights standards into platforms' decision-making. We are enormously fortunate to have two of the authors with us, along with a commentator, and together I think this panel is perfectly suited to discuss the topic. I should note at the outset that unfortunately I've just heard back from Jack Balkin that he's had a conflict that's come up, so he will not be joining us today, I'm afraid. We will be offering refunds for anyone who is interested in that. However, I'm still very excited about this conversation, and I think it is a really timely and important issue to discuss. The session will begin with a presentation from the authors, followed by commentary on the paper and the issues that it raises, following which we'll have some discussion and Q&A. If at any point you have a question or a comment, please feel free to enter it into the chat, or you can raise your hand. We're happy to start a queue for when the Q&A begins at any point. I will note at the outset that the meeting is being recorded, so if you activate your camera, your image may be captured as part of that. I will, for those of you who haven't had a chance to take a look at the paper series yet, I'm posting a link to it into the chat. You're welcome to browse all 5 of the papers, and I'll get started by introducing our excellent panel. Jan Rydzak is the company engagement lead and a research analyst at Ranking Digital Rights, which he joined in November 2019. At RDR, he coordinates engagement with companies and other private sector actors throughout the research process and conducts research on companies' human rights disclosures. Prior to joining RDR, Jan worked as an associate director for program at Stanford University's Global Digital Policy Incubator. His doctoral research focused on the impact of network shutdowns on protests, and he has published several further studies on the human rights harms generated by extreme forms of digital repression. He has also worked as a fellow with the European Commission, a consultant with the United Nations Department of Political and Peace-Building Efforts and Peace Operations, and a Google Policy Fellow with the GNI. He holds a PhD and an MA in Government and Public Policy from the University of Arizona, as well as an MA in Modern Languages from Marie Curie University in Poland. He's fluent in Polish, Portuguese, Spanish, and French. I think we're going to be sticking to English for this event, but we'll see. Elizabeth Renieris is the founding director of the Notre Dame-IBM Technology Ethics Lab, the applied research and development arm of the University of Notre Dame's Technology Ethics Center, where she helps develop and oversee projects to promote human rights values in technology. She's also a Technology and Human Rights Fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard Kennedy School of Government, a practitioner fellow at Stanford's Digital Society Lab, and an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. Elizabeth's focus Work is focused on cross-border data governance frameworks, as well as the ethical challenges and human rights implications of digital identity, blockchain, and other new and advanced technologies. As the founder and CEO of Hacky Lawyer, a consultancy focused on law and policy engineering, Elizabeth has advised the World Bank, the UK Parliament, the European Commission, and a variety of international organizations and NGOs on these subjects. She's also working on a forthcoming book about the future of data governance through MIT Press. She holds a Master of Laws from the London School of Economics, a JD from Vanderbilt, and a BA from Harvard College. And Dunstan Allison-Hope joined BSR, Business for Social Responsibility, in 2004, and currently oversees their human rights and diversity, equity, and inclusion teams. He leads BSR's work at the intersection of technology and human rights. He brings significant experience working in North America, EMEA, and Asia on a diverse range of other sustainable business issues, such as sustainability reporting and disclosure, sustainability strategy, and stakeholder engagement. Dunstan facilitated the multi-stakeholder process of developing global principles of freedom of expression and privacy, which led to the launch of the Global Network Initiative in October 2008. He also helped to create the Electronic Industry Citizenship Coalition, a collaborative initiative of more than 100 technology companies, improving conditions in their supply chains. Dunstan participated in the process of creating the Global Reporting Initiative G3 guidelines and is a regular commentator on issues of corporate accountability reporting and human rights. Between 1999 and 2004, Dunstan was a part of British Telecommunications Corporate Responsibility team in London. So with that introduction, we have three excellent panelists to discuss these issues. I think we are going to go first to Jan for the first half of the discussion of his paper. Jan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's actually going to be just a couple of minutes, hopefully, first. So I will start in a pretty orthodox way, just by acknowledging Michael and saying, thank you. Michael has been phenomenal in this process, and I think everyone involved will agree. Much better at communication than me, for sure. But I also, I think all of us who co-authored this paper just really appreciate everyone who commented on it. It's much better for it, and I think it added this sort of exoskeleton of quality that it was lacking in the first sort of iteration. So as a sort of background note, this paper was conceived by our co-author, Natalie Marichal at Ranking Digital Rights. The fact that she's not here with us at this presentation is only due to the fact that that she's on parental leave. So I hope we did her work justice by helping to bring this to the finish line, and to set the scene sort of on a thematic level. So RDR as an organization, we evaluate companies on their policies and practices that may affect users' rights, and we focus mainly on sort of two areas: privacy and freedom of expression and information. And the way we do it is that we sort of penetrate the dark recesses, for lack of a better word, of the sources that companies make publicly available, under the premise that the end user must be able to see those policies and practices clearly and understand what those are. So this paper in particular, it sort of grew out of previous work on this on similar topics by Natalie, as well as by Rebecca McKinnon and other colleagues at RDR, most notably in a series of 2 reports titled "It's the Business Model." And I think that title sort of leaves little doubt as to RDR's institutional position on the topic. And at the heart of these reports is the idea that tech companies will never really be able to fully deal with problematic speech at the content level. So instead of seeking to sort of hold them liable for content, as I think a lot of us are familiar with through some more or less misbegotten proposals to reform Section 230, regulators, civil society, other stakeholders should focus on essentially 2 things. So one is to prioritize the focus on reach rather than speech, so the ways in which content is amplified and targeted. But 2, just as importantly, the sort of structural underpinnings that perpetuate this model. And this paper zeroes in on that sort of second area. So we argue, broadly speaking, that misinformation and the contagious way in which it spreads is a downstream manifestation of failures that happen upstream at the level of corporate governance, and those failures sort of percolate down into the system. And the 2 sort of broad solutions that we propose to address this problem is to reform corporate leadership structures and to enable investors to exercise greater oversight. So Elizabeth is going to cover the first part, and I know she also has some sort of broad remarks to start us off with. And I will, do my best to do justice to that second sort of thematic part of our paper. So with that, I think over to Elizabeth.
Thanks, Jan. Yeah, and thank you to Michael. I agree. You've been wonderful throughout this process, so we're very happy to participate. And thanks to Natalie as well for having the original idea for this. So I think the opening remarks I want to make actually are inspired by a recent article by Karen Howe in MIT Tech Review yesterday, where she did a 9-month-long investigation into decision-making and organizational structure within Facebook. And so many of you may have seen the article or heard about it. And it's quite timely that we're talking about this paper, because I think it's important at the outset to just think about how we view corporate governance and what its relevance is in the context of mis and disinformation. So you may have heard of corporate governance framed as the sort of 4 Ps, if you will: people, policies, procedures, and processes. And within those 4 sets of tools, there are also standards like accountability, fairness, transparency, and then sometimes responsibility, independence, or leadership. And the permutations of those constitute this notion of corporate governance, which, much like governance, is really an idea of relative checks and balances and ways of managing and balancing often competing interests of different stakeholders, both individual stakeholders, but also entities within companies and also outside of companies. So within companies, the entities will be things like board structures and committees, management organizations, certainly individuals, executive leadership positions, and then outside, of course, civil society, other actors that are regulators, law and policymakers, and then a mix of other stakeholders as well. So I think thinking about it in terms of those 4 pillars is really important and very timely, because what we've really been witnessing is a real lack of policies, procedures, and processes across the companies who are really predominant in the conversation around mis and disinformation. Particularly, what we're seeing is, in lieu of those types of policies, procedures, and processes, we're seeing a lot of decision making that's really driven by a very small handful of individuals, politics and power, and specifically kowtowing to those in power, and also personalities. So this is a very different frame from a sort of corporate governance approach to systemic risks and problems. In our paper, the way that we approach our first structural reform, which is focused on company leadership, is we sort of look at the status quo, and we point to examples of what's not working in terms of this breakdown of the policies, procedures, and processes. We point to specific examples where individuals and politics and personalities are overriding decision making. Then we sort of look at what corporate best practices should inform the decision-making within the companies. And then finally, we look at what are the sort of legal and regulatory levers for reform. So some of the examples we can quickly highlight for those who may not have seen the paper are Anki Das, who actually recently left Facebook in India in, I believe, October, which was in the middle of writing this initial section. We had to keep changing it because things kept changing within the company. But she herself had sort of been promoting hate speech and supporting political speech in favor of the ruling party in India, and was overriding sort of the procedural and policy-driven decisions within the company in India that would have otherwise led to a different set of outcomes in terms of mis and disinformation on the platform. And she, it wasn't the first time that she'd sort of intervened in these content moderation decisions in favor of the ruling party, in favor of sort of kowtowing to power. And it led to massive controversy. But of course, what we've learned is that removing a single individual doesn't solve the challenges that we're highlighting. Another problem that people are probably well aware of within Facebook is the role of Joel Kaplan, for example, and the role that played in decisions around political mis and disinformation leading up to the election, and also leading up, of course, to January 6th. And actually yesterday, for those who may have read the article by Karen Howe, there was a very specific reference to the fact that even though content teams were trying to be sort of policy driven and have meetings around specific content related decisions, there were these sort of secondary or shadow meetings organized within Joel Kaplan's team that were overriding the sort of policy driven decision making. So these were driven largely by things like political considerations, and once again assessing who's in power. And we've already seen how much decision making has changed within the organization since the election and even since January 6th. So the reason we've highlighted Facebook is just because of the sort of timeliness of it, and also because there were many examples to point to, but also because of some of the work that RDR has done in the space. But really the specific examples we point to just demonstrate that there is fundamentally weak top-level human rights related oversight within the corporate leadership structures. And that there are these one-off personal interventions and backroom content decisions that are overriding any type of procedural or rules-based decision-making. Even though these companies will say that they do have human rights oversight, there are actually specific examples of them intervening to prevent that kind of thing. So for example, there was a 2020 shareholder proposal to introduce a human rights expert onto Facebook's board, and only got about 3.7% of the shareholder vote because of heavy lobbying by Facebook's board. So that could have been a very clear sort of opportunity for oversight there. And across the board, the evidence of actual oversight for these human rights related risks remains largely the exception rather than the rule. So for example, Google's board of directors, or rather Alphabet, has also not had any kind of systematic oversight over things like freedom of expression. They only recently brought a privacy expert under the purview of the board's audit committee. And likewise, Twitter has not made any public statements about board level oversight of core human rights. All they've said so far is that their data protection officer provides regular updates to the board as part of their efforts around privacy. So we've got a problem here. In terms of what can be done, looking at this from corporate best practices, there are fundamentally three things. One is around board composition and expertise. So unless we get to the point where these boards have an actual independent expert in civil and human rights, particularly around freedom of expression, privacy, and freedom from discrimination, when we're thinking about a problem like mis and disinformation and hate speech. And unless they have a separate committee who's overseeing these human rights policies and practices, we're really not going to get very far. In addition to board composition and expertise, we need an independent chairperson on the board to ensure proper checks and balances. So this means that we don't want to see CEO duality. So for example, Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook is both CEO and chairman of the board, which basically means that he's accountable only to himself. This duality effectively undermines any other accountability that the board could exercise. What it also does is it results in a single set of interests overriding competing interests and values. So when you have one individual who exercises pretty much total control over a board with virtually no human rights expertise, you can see how any human rights related risks or decision making are not going to be adequately assessed and are also going to be subverted to other interests, particularly financial health, and as we've seen, particularly highlighted yesterday, growth above all else. Another concern there is because of the global nature of the company, but because fundamentally they're US based, when we look at this from a corporate governance standpoint, companies that are listed on things like NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange are, without that sort of composition, expertise, and independence, are going to favor things like First Amendment values over a different version of freedom of expression and over differences that manifest in their global user base, further exacerbating the disconnect and the sort of effective global human rights oversight. So another manifestation of this and another sort of best practice that we'd recommend is separating the government relations team from the content functions within these companies. And so that's, again, a structural reform that we think will ultimately have a pretty significant impact on the way that content-related decisions are made. We sometimes call this a sort of human rights by design approach. to embed this from within the leadership structure, and then to have teams that mirror the high-level leadership structure across the company and across not just within the domiciled parent company, but across the company all around the world. So turning to the sort of legal and regulatory levers for reform, here I think it's important to say that the fact that these companies are predominantly US-based is both a blessing and a curse. So in some ways, it means that our legal and regulatory levers are very limited because the US is very reluctant to intervene into corporate affairs and very reluctant in general to impose ways for companies to run their businesses. However, it's also a massive opportunity because it means to the extent that there are any effective levers for reform in the US, there's potential there to scale those benefits globally. So there are a bunch of rules that apply, obviously, when we're thinking about holding companies accountable, everything, obviously, from the ones everyone on this call is familiar with, from the Exchange Act to the reforms from Dodd-Frank, but also SEC-specific rules and regulations and guidelines, and then also, really importantly, listing standards published by the exchanges themselves. So again, in the companies that we're thinking about predominantly, the NYSE, the New York Stock Exchange, and NASDAQ. And they have specific rules around corporate governance practices. And then, of course, companies are subject to their own bylaws. And what's interesting is that even though there's been a reluctance to intervene, typically we do see more intervention when there is a major global crisis. So, of course, in the wake of the financial crisis in 2008, we did see massive corporate reforms following the collapse of Lehman Brothers. And the idea was to restore sort of public confidence in the global financial regulatory system by improving corporate governance. We think we're at a similar point with these large content-driven platforms, where we really need a comprehensive set of reforms. And we do think that the SEC should adopt specific rules regarding civil and human rights expertise, the way that they've now required financial expertise at the board level following the financial crisis. But that expertise alone will be insufficient, of course, without the proper independence and oversight at the board level. So federal and state laws typically don't dictate board composition in the US. However, the stock exchange listing rules actually do require independence on the board. And they also require things like disclosure of things like CEO duality. So 2009 amendments to Regulation SK of the Exchange Act actually require companies to disclose their rationale for combining the role of CEO and chair if they choose to do so, and to file that in their proxy statements. So the idea is to provide that kind of transparency that can enable effective accountability from shareholders. Finally, with these reforms in mind, we also want to acknowledge that because of the limitations around sort of legal and regulatory intervention into companies, this will also require a whole toolkit of other reforms to accompany them, along with things like competition and antitrust related measures, data protection and privacy measures, consumer protection, and others. So it's by no means meant to be sort of a one-stop shop. However, we do think that it's a really important start that, again, we think if we can hold these companies accountable here, then potentially the structural reforms will impact the effectiveness of their policies, procedures, and processes across the company worldwide. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jan.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So as a transition, I guess, one of the things that Elizabeth mentioned is that, misinformation is also fundamentally a story of power, right? But it's also, I would say, a story of money. And the second part of our paper, also sort of focuses on the fact that investors are a very big and major sort of vector of change. And I think, we're sort of living in a time where concerns about human rights are being more and more prominently linked to companies' financial incentives. In other words, human rights risks are material risks, and that's sort of emerging consensus also among investors. The reputational risks and making the underlying structures more accountable is kind of core to protecting users and defending them against human rights abuses, including those stemming from misinformation. So among institutional investors, a lot of these risks are captured under the umbrella of ESG, which stands for environmental, social, and corporate governance. And that is a sort of broad set of metrics which measures the sustainability and societal impacts of investing in a company. And I can tell you firsthand, we just published the 2020 RDR index 2 weeks ago, and not only are investors increasingly reluctant overall to be sort of associated with businesses that enable these abuses, but also I would say that a lot of companies are reading the room, right? They're prioritizing ESG disclosures. They're understanding that they might eventually suffer some untoward consequences, whether financial or non-financial. And some of the surveys that we cite in our paper also say that most institutional investors also sort of favor the use of ESG frameworks to assess non-financial risks. I think the challenge is to make that easier, right? So investors also direct themselves through these disclosures, and the more information they have available, the more they can make responsible investments. So we know that money talks, and we also know that sort of the existing paradigms have been partially questioned, overturned on previous occasions. I'm thinking of fossil fuels, conflict minerals, topics like that. And part of the change in the sort of zeitgeist in both of these cases was driven by this growing awareness that this is not the way of the future. This is not the way it should be. So one of our arguments in the paper is that it's important to sort of ensure that the voice of investors who prioritize responsible practices is heard when it comes to complex problems like misinformation. And among investors, as Elizabeth intimated, one of the vehicles of oversight is the investor resolution, right, which is a formal kind of proposal which the company's shareholders vote on at the company's annual meeting. And for example, as Elizabeth mentioned, last year there were multiple resolutions that aimed to nominate human rights experts to the board of directors of both Alphabet and Facebook. These resolutions generally fail. Most of them are non-binding, but what they do is they serve as sort of semaphores, I would say. So they're signals of what investors care about, right? And one of the reasons that they fail is that tech companies in particular tend to have these skewed voting structures in which there's a superclass that's made up of founders, board members, company insiders, what have you. These people typically hold between 10 and 20 times the voting power that regular shareholder does. Facebook is one of those companies. In some cases, there's also a third tier of shareholders with zero voting rights. For example, Alphabet has a structure like that. And what all of this does, as we argue, is that it concentrates the decision-making power in a small clique of people. But it also sort of cements the core business model of a company, and it erodes the chances of remodeling it in line with international human rights standards. So interventions. What can be done about it in the context of the big tech platforms? And we fully recognize that most interventions are focused, or most of the interventions that we propose are focused on the US. But again, as Elizabeth mentioned, they can have sort of ripple effects for these companies' global operations. So there are a few things that we highlight in the paper. One of them is for the SEC to enact rules that require companies with these dual or multi-class share structures to explain their rationale for doing so. Elizabeth told you about the same requirements that already exist for CEO duality. We would like to see, ideally, we would like to see the skewed share structures being completely phased out. But the chances of that happening in the US, regardless, I would say, of who is in power, are pretty dismal. Even if other countries have done so to some extent, we don't think it's necessarily realistic to expect that in the US. However, the SEC still has sort of the clout and the ability to push companies to disclose why they are adopting unequal share structures, why they are retaining them if they already have them. What is the size of the wedge, as it's called, between company ownership and control of the vote on resolutions, with the sort of underlying knowledge that all of these practices can entrench bad governance for a very long time. And I think Facebook is a pretty good illustration of that. Secondly, we would like to see entities like the SEC passing rules that encourage shareholder activism through whether shareholder resolutions or other means. And part of that is to sort of first roll back some of the damage that was dealt during the Trump administration. And some of the changes that took place during the previous administration made it more difficult for investors to put their petitions on the table in the first place. And one example here is the SEC a few years ago increased the value of the stock that you have to hold before you can file a resolution, right? So that shuts out a lot of the investors, especially smaller investors, who might have a greater focus on responsible investing, including topics related to human rights. So unless these things are rolled back, in a way, we'd be kind of building a structure on a foundation of quicksand, for lack of a better word, right? So the point is, we have to roll back these rules that fossilize the status quo before we can really break it. Third, the SEC, as we argue in the paper, should pass rules that specifically require companies that are publicly traded to disclose the percentage of their revenue that comes from targeted advertising. And we realize this is essentially a targeted recommendation for Facebook, but also the other major social media platforms that rely on targeting to a large extent. As of Facebook's most recent disclosures, if I'm not mistaken, 98.9% of their revenue comes from advertising. But so far, nobody has been able to persuade Facebook to do things like disclose data on how many ads it restricts, how many ads it takes down, how much of that volume was taken down for violations of their targeting policies. So there is a strong feeling, I think, that we need additional incentives, and investors are, certainly take a lot of interest in those kinds of interventions. And then lastly, I would highlight that we also propose that requirements be introduced for companies to disclose non-financial information about their ESG impacts, and that includes things like information about the social impacts, the human rights impacts of systems like algorithmic recommendation systems, targeted advertising again. These kinds of interventions, which I think some of us are familiar with intimately because we've been involved with things like human rights due diligence. These kinds of interventions can snowball across the structures of a company. And I think the common thread in everything that we've talked about so far is that these are sort of ways of empowering investors to exercise more intense scrutiny, because it allows them to vote and invest based on solid information, more precise information, rather than continuing to swim in this sea of opacity, which some companies tend to perpetuate. And with that, I think I'll end there. There's of course a lot more to talk about, but I think we can just leave that for the discussion. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. Just before we go over to Dunstan, I just want to flag a couple of quick things. Elizabeth mentioned that this is one aspect of the problem, and it's not a panacea. I would urge folks to check out the other papers in this series, which do target other angles of this. They don't tangle the competition and antitrust issue, which is a huge thing to dig into. But there's proposals around information literacy, around channeling funding to local journalism, around supporting local inputs to content moderation structures. And we explicitly designed the series to provide this kind of menu of alternatives as part of that. So I would urge folks to check that out. And I also wanted to say briefly, I'm struck by, we've heard so many different kind of novel theories being floated around improving performance and structure, some of which take governance structures in a novel direction, like following a public service media model or nationalization or all this stuff. And so it really struck me reading this, that what you're describing seem to be these very basic corporate governance reforms, the things that I would think be beneficial to all companies. And I was just so struck as somebody who's been involved in these in these discussions and heard all these sort of novel theories coming out. On the one hand, it's an intuitive place to start to apply the kind of things that we would want to apply to any company. But it's also so striking to me that these companies are so powerful and so influential, and they're based on these obviously problematic governance structures. So it was really interesting reading that. And I'll stop there because I don't want to poach too much from any of Dunstan's comments, which I'm very interested to hear.
Great, and +1 to those comments. So I'd also like to start by saying thank you, Michael, for the invitation, and to Jan, Elizabeth, and Natalie for the excellent paper and for your tremendous work at Ranking Digital Rights. It's been wonderful to see the impact of the organization over the years since it was founded. And I feel like here I get the luxurious job of commenting on the good ideas of others rather than presenting my own, which seems to be a very luxurious position to be in. I've been working both inside and with companies on human rights and corporate responsibility for nearly 25 years now, which I think takes us to pre-COVID times. I'm not entirely sure. And I've reached the conclusion that we need an all of the above approach to change. And Jan, I was struck by your phrase snowballing. I think that would be another way of thinking about this. I think it's going to take lots of different strategies and tactics pursued by many different actors in different ways to achieve change. But that means that I do believe there's an essential role for government, for regulation and rules. And I find myself agreeing with the bulk of the proposals presented in the paper. And Michael, similarly, I'm struck by how basic some of the concepts actually are. So to pick up a few things, I really like the emphasis on director expertise on human rights. And I would say that the need for expertise at board level is probably the single most important improvement we can make. And I'm struck by how we have a similar conversation on other topics. There's a whole discussion going on around climate change expertise at board level as well. And I think that whole discussion around expertise at board level is perhaps the most important. I do express a little bit of caution about the notion of a standalone human rights board committee. I do think human rights, corporate responsibility, ESG have a big role to play at board level and in board committees. I tend to prefer an integrated model where human rights and ESG is integrated into the work of existing committees rather than given its own standalone committee where it risks being siloed. And I would note, since the paper's been written, Alphabet have begun to move in that direction. So Alphabet have now made human rights a responsibility of one of their board committees. I like the requirement that the CEO and chair roles should be divided, that dual class share structures should be restricted. And I have historically been a big fan of disclosure requirements for companies. I think disclosure on non-financial issues that are material to the world around us, not simply material to shareholders, is absolutely essential. And in fact, that's how I got into this field in the first place in the 1990s. And we've seen a significant improvement in non-financial disclosure from companies. But I think it needs to be regulated for it to become more comparable, more decision useful, more systematic, fewer free riders, that type of thing. I like the notion of mandatory human rights due diligence that you brought up in the paper. And in particular, that the board should have oversight on human rights due diligence. And that's perhaps where I'd just like to focus my final remarks. So at BSR, we support the establishment of mandatory human rights due diligence requirements for companies. Those are working their way through the European Union right now. I would support them in the United States. I would support them in other jurisdictions as well. I think they're essential for establishing minimum expectations around human rights for companies and establishing a more consistent approach across all companies. However, I think we need to be careful to make sure that human rights becomes a strategic concern for companies and not just a compliance concern. And a key word in that sentence is "and." I would like to see human rights being a strategic concern to business and a compliance concern. And that's one reason why I think board level expertise and not just board level obligations are important. I think they go hand in hand. So three quick points to share. One, I do think human rights due diligence, focus on human rights should be a really forward-looking exercise rather than just focusing on today's problems. And I referenced climate change earlier on. There's a lot of interesting thinking in the climate change field around scenarios and companies understanding how the evolving impacts of climate change may impact their business in reverse. I think there's a lot that we in the human rights field can learn from the climate change field in terms of being more forward-looking and anticipating change. Second, we should recognize that the human rights impacts of a single company don't exist in isolation, but exist as part of a broader system. We're not going to achieve our goals through lots of companies acting alone, but collaborative initiatives, multi-stakeholder initiatives are essential. And I think that's why I think these things need to be a strategic concern as much as a compliance one. And then finally, and this might spark some discussion, I think we need to make sure that connections are drawn between human rights due diligence and value creation. Companies are required to maintain a formal register of risks to enterprise value creation. So sort of have a formal record of material risks to enterprise value. I think companies should be required to maintain a formal register of risks to human rights, that should be a similarly formal requirement. But I also think we need to understand the connection between the two. What is the interplay between human rights and enterprise value creation? And there, I think there's one additional piece I would like to add to the discussion, which is the notion of time horizon and the notion of value creation for the medium and long term. It has been very interesting to see the impact letters from the CEOs of BlackRock and Vanguard and other big investors have had on these issues inside companies. I'd call it, usual phrase, snowballing, Jan. They've been very impactful and have really focused on the notion of long-term value creation. And so I wonder if we can alter the business case narrative from the very sort of short-term, user engagement on the platform, some of the user metrics quarter by quarter, and look at how companies are creating value for the long term. And I wonder if there's potential in shifting that dialogue. Anyway, those are my observations on what I thought was an excellent paper. I really do like the way you've drawn connections between some pretty basic and important corporate governance reforms that need to happen and some very specific issues around misinformation and human rights in the technology industry. I think there needs to be more connection between those two worlds. And actually, this has just come to mind. For those interested in those connections, keeping an eye on the work of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board is going to be useful. They're in the middle of consulting on some metrics around content governance, and SASB are very much in that sort of corporate governance investor relations world, and they're trying to get to know the digital rights world. And I think that's a place where more connections need to be made. So Michael, back to you.
Thank you. Yeah, if you want to post a link into the chat for where folks can follow up with that, I think there'd be a lot of people interested. I very much appreciate your, I was going to say your last point, but I think it was your second last point, where you talked about the fundamental challenge in understanding value. We as part of our review process, we passed this paper by a colleague that works solidly on the corporate law side. And what they came back with was to say, look, the purpose of a company is to provide funding for it, is to generate revenue for its shareholders. This is taking us outside of that mandate. How do you connect that to this core purpose of the company? They have a fiduciary obligation to their shareholders. So, I'm sure it's an argument that you're very familiar with. So it's a fundamental challenge to bridge that. Maybe I would encourage any folks with questions or comments to either raise their hand or put them in the chat. I'll first give Jan and Elizabeth maybe a chance to respond to any of the issues that were raised, if you'd like.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to the comment about taking a more strategic rather than a compliance-driven approach. I think that's something we definitely point to in the paper, particularly because when we're thinking about freedom of expression or the sort of rights and values implicated in the conversation around mis and disinformation, there really is no other option because there's very limited consensus at an international level around what sort of harmful but lawful content is, or what apart from things like child sexual abuse material or CSAM, there isn't the consensus is very slow to emerge around what is unlawful or illegal or even harmful. And so I think that necessitates a strategic approach, right, that's driven by something other than a tick box sort of compliance approach. So I think that's a really excellent point. I think also to the point that she made, Dunstan, about the standalone committee versus the integration into ESG. So this is where I think it is also a question of timing and sequence. I think there is some initial value in the separation just because of the particular crisis around freedom of expression and concerns around mis and disinformation and hate speech, where there could be value in sort of having a very explicit focus on those types of issues and not subsuming them into the broader conversation, just because that's sort of the crisis that the platforms are in right now. That being said, I think one of the things we try and point out in our paper is that we really reject this notion of, you know, what Facebook calls real world harms, or this, this kind of separation between, you know, whatever the other part is and then the real world. And what we're trying to say is that they can't be separated. And so I think you're right that in the longer term, you know, these are part of the S in ESG, the social, is really what's the impact on people. And that's the piece that's really missing. And so what we're trying to say in this is that, you know, the decision making at Facebook is a bit like an unsupervised, you know, algorithm where there is no discernible procedure we can hold accountable. There's no policy driven decision making. So I think it's really just, like you said, a question of sequencing and the short term versus the long term. And certainly I think quarterly reporting is problematic, right? I think it distorts incentives in a way that we see where there'll be a, you know, even the Stop Hate for Profit campaign last summer, and then we'll see a quarterly report and, you know, the share price going up. And so there is a real disconnect, I think, between the short term and the long term, but I'll turn it over to Jan.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. I mean, I just have a few sort of quick points, I guess. First of all, thank you, you know, to both Michael and Dunstan for your excellent comments. I think I fully agree with the fact that, you know, the interventions, and this is a sort of long-standing point for RDR as well, that all of these interventions are kind of like like cells interlinked within one stem, if you're you know in the mood for citing Nabokov or Blade Runner, if that's more up your alley. So in a lot of these discussions, you know, I think we don't always fully account for the fact that there are sort of multiple vectors of pressure, right, and that they work together organically. And I think sometimes when you're not as sort of plugged into these conversations as we are at this very moment, because of the sort of recent release of the RDR index, that is not always very clear. But you know, we have seen a surge of interest, certainly as a result of the publication of the index. I would say I fully agree with the fact that, you know, there's a reason why the mandatory human rights due diligence requirements are emerging, and that, you know, that primary reason is the lack of consensus around the standards that exists right now, right? So, and that I think is a problem that is systemic for the platforms, not only in terms of, you know, how they conduct due diligence, but also in terms of things like how they conduct transparency reporting, right? So if you sort of look into the transparency report of Facebook in particular, I think some of us on this call are intimately familiar with how they do transparency reporting, but there's a lot that you can sort of read between the lines there. There's a lot of aggregation going on. You know, Facebook as a company sort of distinguishes between different types of restrictions that it applies to content, but in their reporting on, you know, how they restrict content, they don't disaggregate, you know, what they do with individual sort of types of content, right? So whether it's a takedown of you know, a given category of content, or you know, account suspensions, putting labels on things, you know, downranking. There's a sort of disconnect there that it seems like it might take more than just sort of light incentives to push them towards improving sort of their disclosures on that. And then one sort of more comment about multi-stakeholder initiatives. You know, again, RDR is very much, you know, in that realm of being, you know, we're all enormous fans of multi-stakeholderism as a sort of North Star, I would say, in terms of, you know, how companies should conduct their business. But there's also, I think, an emerging sort of notion that the existing multi-stakeholder structures are not sufficient, right? So, you know, the Global Network Initiative is an excellent sort of you know, collective of people who are driving towards the same goal. That being said, you know, the excellent work that GNI does on you know, things like government regulations, you know, relations with governments in general, that is, you know, with the caveat that that is extremely valuable. there's a whole other world of policy enforcement and algorithmic systems and targeted advertising that the existing initiatives don't fully cover, right? And of course, a lot of initiatives can sort of claim the mantle of multi-stakeholderism, right? But what we would like to see in whatever emerges in the next years, as far as multi-stakeholder structures go, is not just a sort of space for companies and investors and academics and others to sort of converse amongst each other, but also solid structures to hold companies accountable, right? Reporting on things beyond their structures, on things like government demands and similar sort of government focused topics. So I'll end it there, but thank you again for your excellent comments.
Yeah, I'll once again invite our audience to either raise your hands at this point or input any questions that you have into the chat. But I would also like to ask maybe all three of you, because in the paper and I think in Elizabeth's presentation as well, you sort of referenced this, that you made the comparison to 2008 and the financial crisis. Which on the one hand is a bit depressing because when you consider how things have evolved on the financial side since then, and maybe not the most optimistic way to frame it. But you mentioned that this has the potential to be sort of a moment of galvanizing institutional change. Kind of how for all three of you, because you're not only all three very keen observers in this space, but I think all three of you have a significant track record of direct engagement with the platforms. How do you see the evolution of platforms' approaches to human rights? Do you see responsibility growing over time? Do you see awareness growing over time? We've certainly seen a lot of moves by the platform. Some would say, some would describe that as the platforms trying to get ahead of regulation. Some would describe that as the platforms being dragged kicking and screaming into a basic recognition of what they need to do. I would love to get a sense from all three of you, maybe starting with Dunstan and then to Elizabeth and then to Jan, of where you see this space evolving.
Yeah, good question. I'm just reflecting on how best to answer it. I struggle to come up with anything more sophisticated than is your glass half empty or half full, or everything's changed and nothing's changed, because I do see significant improvement in approaches to human rights in the main platform companies. We are seeing, and I expect to see, more robust policy commitments to international human rights law and international human rights standards. We are seeing investment in human rights teams that are gaining more influence, more clout inside companies. We are seeing more investment in human rights assessments. I would say one of the things that I really took away from the Ranking Digital Rights Assessment was how poorly the companies performed on systematic human rights due diligence, but also how that presents an opportunity for significant improvement, especially when put alongside the managed human rights due diligence coming in from the European Union. And I would say actually your question gets to the battle that I have in my mind all the time, having been in this field for 25 years. I spend some of my time thinking, wow, it's been tremendous to work with companies on such impactful initiatives that have created change, and seeing companies do things differently now than perhaps they would have done 10, 25 years ago, and yet see that the world around us has not changed to anything like the degree I would like to see it change. With the 2020s is the only decade we have available to address climate change. If we don't get it right in the 2020s, we're completely screwed. And so I think there does need to be a massive sense of urgency around government action and alongside company action. The test is whether this is the galvanizing moment, right? We all have our roles to play right now in using the fact we've just had a pandemic, we're going through political polarization. How can we turn this moment to our advantage? Because if we don't, the 2020s is really the decade where this is a make or break time.
Sorry, did Jan or Elizabeth, did you want to respond to that?
I don't have a direct response, but I have some thoughts sparked by your question, which is, I think what's interesting is when we think about what led to ESG concerns around things like, forced labor in supply chains or environmental related harms, or leading up to the RGGI principles or the UNGPs. I mean, I think what's different now is that there's a big disconnect between, the users of these platforms and then the customers, for example, who are the advertisers, and then the stakeholders that have influence over the company. So it was very different when you had, for example, supply chain issues for Nike, and customers could sort of boycott and put pressure on the company to take concerns more seriously and then implement reforms. The whole world in some ways could boycott Facebook. I mean, sure, it would impact advertisers, but it's less direct than, so for example, with Stop Pay for Profit, we saw this massive disconnect between, who's impacted and then what kind of pressure can they exert. And this is why I think that, the sort of table stakes, as you rightly point out, of corporate governance are so important, because really our only levers are the sort of, the self-regulatory mechanisms within corporate governance, backed by the sort of light touch of law and regulation in that domain, and then this other array of tools from a regulatory standpoint that need to be layered on top. But what we have now is we have the companies continually calling for, clear or new laws and regulations, but then objecting to every proposal put forward. And then also attempting to self-regulate without having these sort of table stakes in place around things like corporate governance. So, and also sort of getting this deference of that we would, give to startups, but really we're talking about, globally dominant platforms. So I think there's just the nature of the businesses are so different from ones where there have been sort of effective ESG measures in the past. And so I think thinking about how we transpose, what was effective in the past, but adapting them to what's different about the business model, again, to point to what Jan said at the outset, and how that really distorts incentives, and how that means that we might have to look at different points to intervene in terms of how to realign those incentives.
And I would just, add to those excellent points that, I think this is as you said, Michael, this is a very timely moment to talk about this. And of course, one of the things that we have definitely seen across all the companies, particularly the social media platforms, is that they were very sort of ready to seize the moment in terms of profiting off the pandemic, but they were certainly not ready to sort of mitigate or address the human rights impacts that could result from it, right? And I think a very, very clear example that actually Elizabeth and I talk about pretty prominently in another piece that we just published, sort of alongside the index, is the fact that, if you compare Facebook and YouTube as, imperfectly comparable platforms, the Facebook's appeals system for content moderation appeals collapsed in the middle of the pandemic, right? And that is sort of, for at least from RDR's perspective, that is essentially, that mechanism is a vector for a basic right that users have, which is the right to remedy. And if even for, the space of 6 months in the course of a year, that basic mechanism collapses, then that sort of, I think, lays bare some of the core sort of systemic problems at the heart of a company. That is not to say that, systems that survived the pandemic or survived the impact of sending, your content moderators home are perfect. I'm sure, there's a lot that we could find, a lot of imperfections that we could find in the way that YouTube, targeted this problem, starting with the fact that, all social media platforms were sort of compelled to some extent because of lack of preparation to, rely more heavily on algorithmic ways to take down and restrict content. But it's still sort of, I think it goes to the larger point that moments of crisis can be, again, excellent opportunities because they sort of lay bare the core problems at the heart of companies. And the fact that we are in this sort of moment of perpetual crisis And the fact that these core systems have collapsed, it is an opening for improvement to ensure that the next crisis does not create the same kind of explosive effect that this one did.
Yeah, it also illustrates prioritization in a certain way. So Elizabeth, I think, has to drop at the top of the hour. So I'll thank her very much for her excellent commentary.
Thanks for having me.
And broadly for her participation in the project. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
And I want to go for a little bit longer though, particularly because there's a question in the chat from Nicholas. I'm going to say Tulak, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, on the role of employee pressure in this formulation and how that can be further supported through policy. I think that's been a really interesting area of discussion, particularly around the Google walkouts. Certainly I think everybody who's engaged at any level with Facebook has had conversations with staff expressing frustrations about one aspect of policy or another. And at the same time, your paper really addresses a lot of the challenges of where they're bringing in all this human rights expertise. There's no dearth of human rights expertise at Facebook and Google and Twitter. There's brilliant human rights people working there. But it's a question of whether or not these people are patched into the decision-making process or whether it's almost routed around them. So I wonder if both of you, maybe first Dustin and then Jan, could speak to that, to offer your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I certainly see employee pressure as being part of the all of the above approach to creating change. And you referenced the Google case, which I'm sure we've all seen. I'm reminded of the late 1990s, people saying, I'm embarrassed to say I work for Shell, and that the Shell CEO recounted how employees being embarrassed saying they worked for Shell was the biggest driver of change rather than shareholder pressure or regulation, what have you. Now, I don't think Shell should exist in the first place. It should go out of business or transition to renewables. But anyway, you get the point that the views and perspectives of employees are taken very seriously by those in decision-making roles inside companies. However, I generally fear anything where how we approach issues becomes, I'm going to use an unfortunate phrase, but a sort of popularity contest, that whoever happens to have the moment of expressing a point of view that grabs attention, that's the thing we focus on. And for me, that's one of the benefits of a human rights-based approach, and why good systems of decision-making, of due diligence should be a requirement of business, that it forces you to think very deliberately about your impact across the full range of internationally recognized human rights, and not simply follow whatever is in the narrative of the day, whatever is in the press that day, whatever concerns being raised by employees. And I think you see that in some of the sort of community standards and guidelines, policies that companies have. They sort of become a Frankenstein monster of, we've just added a paragraph to respond to the latest thing. Whereas I think a human rights-based approach would suggest something more deliberate and systematic. If I could just pick up on one other thing, which point that Elizabeth made on multi-stakeholder organizations, and Michael, you asked the question about how much has changed. It is interesting to note that when the Global Network Initiative was launched, it was, and still is, a genuinely multi-stakeholder initiative where companies only have 50% of the votes on the board. Since then, a number of other collaborative initiatives have been launched. Counterterrorism, for one, it's a new organization around digital trust and safety, that are not multi-stakeholder in the same way, that don't have multi-stakeholder governance structures. And I think that's something that's important to consider in this broader discussion around corporate governance. They're not a replacement by any means for laws and regulations that apply to companies on human rights, but they play an important role. And I would like to see more investment in multi-stakeholder models and governance structures.
Yeah, I mean, I think without aspiring to match the quality of what Dunstan said, with on Dunstan's last point, I think I would fully agree. I guess sort of the danger for me, and I think for I speak for a lot of sort of colleagues at RDR, is that some of these sort of experimental organizations might sort of carry this veneer of legitimacy that they might not fully deserve, right? Obviously, this is a time of experimentation, but I feel like, especially in the context of things like algorithmic accountability and targeted advertising, there is this sort of danger of companies becoming becoming part of entities or organizations that are that call themselves multi-stakeholder organizations, but are not, do not sort of fulfill those basic requirements. And one of the I think one of the biggest sort of gaps that that we've identified in some of these emerging entities is just the fact that there's no accountability, right? Or at least weak mechanisms for accountability. So it kind of creates an idea that, or projects the idea that companies are interested in responsible actions and responsible creation of algorithms and so on, but that the sort of looking under the hood is not necessarily within the scope of what they want to do within the within the activities of those initiatives. And on Nicholas's question, while I am not personally very plugged into to the conversations on sort of bottom-up initiatives, I do agree that there is an element of the news cycle being a prominent part of this conversation. And certainly, having more structure, and especially under the sort of umbrella of the protection of human rights, is important. I would say, those initiatives, I mean, they are aspirationally great. It's just that they do have a sort of mixed record of success, I would say, including, recent conversations within Google about the potentially, discriminatory firing of their AI ethics experts. So that is a conversation that is sort of important, that is very important to have. At the same time, there are very major questions about to what extent top management and top executives listen to those important voices. And again, sort of circling back to what we talked about at the start of this conversation, that if you look at the proxy statements of companies, getting to that top level, whether it's about human rights due diligence or human rights expertise at the board level, it's like an unscalable mountain, right? It's like an impossible challenge. And the argument is kind of always the same. We have the requisite expertise. We have people, at the management level, at the executive level. We don't see the need for additional structures to, reinforce what we already have, because we're, proud of what we have already built, and we don't need that at the top level. It's hard to say, how best to target that problem. But eventually, I think the zeitgeist will change in favor of that. And I'm looking forward to seeing the first major tech company with a human rights expert on its board.
Yeah, getting the news cycle out of policymaking, or I guess I should just say, no longer having policymaking driven by the news cycle and building more predictability and reliability and consistency is such an important point. And particularly since I think that aspect of it and the reactive nature of policymaking also helps to drive the US focus of a lot of policymaking to the detriment of emerging issues around the world, because there's so much of a focus of reacting to the latest news of the day in DC or what's going on there, that it really leads to this still myopic focus on serving their American impact, to the detriment of the enormous and much more severe global impact in a lot of cases. So I have two more questions now. Again, anybody from the audience who wants to chime in, you're very welcome to. But barring that, I'll ask two more kind of more narrow focus questions. One of them, and again, I'd love to hear from both of you on this. You both mentioned this idea of greater transparency and publication of the human rights processes. Are either of you concerned in any way, or do you have thoughts on the potential impact of publishing this stuff on the human rights impact assessment process? Is there any chance that it would harm or hinder the ability to get honest assessments of these things? Would they be drafted in a more careful way? I'm in general a huge impact of transparency, but that's just an objection that I could see being raised. Maybe I don't know who wants to go first on this. Dunstan, do you want to, or not to put you on the spot?
Sorry, I had a mute problem. If I go first on this one, Jan, you can go first on the next one. How about that? So I think there's a risk we focus too much on transparency around the human rights impact assessment and not enough around transparency on the human rights due diligence process, because there's been a sense, Facebook and other companies have published human rights assessments, and that's become a thing that people have focused on. And while those assessments have addressed some of the most severe impacts that those companies have, they don't address the overall due diligence process, and they don't cover lots of important things that one would need to know about the human rights performance of a company in order to make informed decisions. So I would just highlight two things. One, I mentioned the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board earlier on. There's another reporting organization to keep an eye on, the Global Reporting Initiative, which about 80% of the world's 500 or so largest companies use. They are in the process of integrating the UN guiding principles into their standards. And that places an emphasis on disclosing the results of the overall human rights due diligence process. And it'd be interesting to see how companies fulfill that disclosure requirement in practice. The second thing is, I've ultimately concluded that the disclosure of an entire human rights impact assessment is sometimes a good thing. It is sometimes a worthwhile, provides a worthwhile point of view into some very important human rights risks and how they're addressed. However, I have generally concluded that some type of summary is perhaps the more sustainable, scalable, practical way forward. So where companies say, we've done the assessment, we followed this process, here are the key findings, and this is what we're doing about them. And then very importantly, report back over time. Right, Principle 20 of the UN Guiding Principles is about tracking. How do you track how well you've done? What are the qualitative, quantitative indicators? How do you get feedback from stakeholders and how you've done? And so I've tended to reach the conclusion that some type of summary rather than the whole thing is the way to go, with some notable exceptions. Don't quote me to say it's never good to publish the whole thing.
Yeah, I would say that this is a really good question, and I think it's a question that sort of applies to a broad range of topics, right? Human rights due diligence. I know there are people on this call who are very interested in network shutdowns. The same concerns occur, in that case, right? There are safety concerns regarding, both the rights of users who are affected, and in some cases, in the case of network shutdowns, at least, the sort of company representatives or employees of the company in a given country. So there are certainly safety concerns, and it's obviously an argument that we get a lot from companies, that there are sort of risks to greater transparency. But I would say overall, there is a sort of slow glacial movement towards progress and consensus on that front. As far as human rights impact assessments and human rights due diligence writ large goes, it's an evolving conversation, and Dunstan is very much aware of it because he's also involved in a lot of the projects around this. But one of the things, if you reach into the Danish Institute for Human Rights and its recent publication that focuses squarely on human rights due diligence and impact assessments for digital activities, one of the things you'll notice is that they do sort of advocate for the publication of human rights impact assessments to the extent that it does not jeopardize the people who are affected. And I understand that this is a position that is easy to take on paper. It's not necessarily easy to implement and practice. And that concern is something that we as RDR have also sort of considered by not integrating an expectation for companies to publish human rights impact assessments, or for that matter, to publish even abbreviated versions of those. It's good practice, but there's a range of levels of quality, I think, that that can come with that. I would say, in general, and a previous iteration of this paper, as Michael knows, had a bit of a larger focus on human rights due diligence and implementing sort of mandatory requirements. I would say that the scarce past precedent that we have suggests, I think, overall that creating consistent requirements as far as due diligence is concerned is a sort of net positive, right? So that as the example that we cited in this previous iteration of the paper was one of the requirements that existed under the previous U.S. sanctions regime for Myanmar, which essentially led to greater and greater improvements of quality in the reporting of human rights risks by companies, right? So again, not a perfect regime, and it existed for a short time. But the fact that it was implemented and led to sort of increasing standardization, I think is a sort of sign of what may happen once the mandatory human rights due diligence requirements are a fact and reality in the European Union, at least.
Yeah, I certainly think that a lot of folks I've heard from other circles of looking to that structure as a potential model going forward. So it is very interesting that you raised the Myanmar example. I have one more question, which is a little bit more, I guess, practical and targeted, or regarding implementation. This is the paper itself is extremely specific and targeted in, which is I think a great strength of it in terms of the reforms that you'd like to see. But there is a regulatory component to it. And so that naturally lends itself to questions about the degree to which companies could or might either somehow threaten to pull back from the applicability of these kinds of rule changes, or to sort of shift their own corporate structure around in a way that kind of mitigates its application. And I guess that, I'm thinking particularly around calls to divorce the chairman and CEO position, which would be a difficult sell for a company like Facebook, I imagine. Is that something that you've thought about? Is that, or do you think that if there was a significant groundswell behind these kinds of reforms, that companies would really feel obligated to if the pressure might be enough to get these companies to change? And particularly in the context of governments around the world are struggling with how and to what degree and jurisdictional challenges around these social media companies. You're writing it in an American context where the jurisdiction is arguably easiest, but are there still jurisdictional challenges that come into play? Maybe I'll go to, I can't remember what the agreement, who was meant to go first on this one.
Sure. I think the agreement was me. So, I mean, I guess this is again a great point. I would say, again, it's we don't have a crystal ball, right? So it's hard to tell how things will change. That being said, even if you sort of take the more pessimistic approach that Facebook is set in its ways, and the primary illustration that we use in this paper is not likely to change, I think there is still a lot of value in terms of trying to drive change in sort of the next Facebook, right? Facebook is not going to be around for centuries, and obviously the tech field is extremely dynamic, and as is sort of the field of social media platforms and their future. So in a way, I feel like the sort of vector of change there might be the next big company, right? I feel like in areas like whether it's CEO duality or dual class share structures, there is sort of an established, mode of doing things, right? I think the statistic that we cite in the paper is that I think like 7 of the 10 recent tech IPOs, as of the writing of the paper, of major companies adopted dual class share structures. But that is not a reality that is set in stone, right? So I think a few days ago we had a major sort of cloud provider called Snowflake that sort of explicitly stated that it would not adopt a dual class share structure. There are a number of major companies, Twitter and Amazon among them, that do not adopt this structure. Of course, it does not, insulate them from the other human rights harms that they might perpetuate. But I would say that those examples of companies that are not yet as fossilized in those in the precedents that we consider to be negative, those can help drive sort of overall change in the industry to the extent that, or to the level that companies like Facebook, which may illustrate some of these negative trends that we try to note in the paper, would feel sort of increasingly isolated in their position, hopefully.
A point came to mind when you asked your question, Michael. I'm not sure if it answers your question, but it's the point that came to mind when you asked it, which is one of the things I really like about the proposals for managing human rights due diligence coming out of Europe is that they are essentially based on the UN guiding principles, which across all jurisdictions, approved by the United Nations, integrated into the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, being integrated into the Global Reporting Initiative requirements. And so you've got rules and regulations that are being put in place in one particular jurisdiction. They're actually based on norms and standards that are not limited to that jurisdiction. And the more we can move in that direction, I think that's a good thing. I have less to say on the CEO chair split and the dual class share structure. I think they should go away, but I'm not sure the sort of pathway to those, because that's not things I've dug into too deeply. The other comment I would make is it'd be interesting to explore the successes and failures of things like the conflict minerals rules and the modern slavery acts that have been introduced. In some ways, they've been extremely effective in focusing attention on some really important issues that need addressing. On the other hand, they've been very narrowly focused. And again, that's what I like about the European managing rights due diligence requirements. They're very broad. I remember sitting in meetings with a few smaller software companies, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, and they were so focused on getting their modern slavery statement out that they weren't really thinking about the human rights of freedom of expression and privacy. I was like, come on, guys, if you're going to take a human rights-based approach, these are the things you really need to focus on. But they were so focused on the modern slavery statement that they weren't actually focusing on the things of greatest relevance. And to the extent to which we can design rules and regulations that push companies towards the most significant impacts, I think, for the better.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Jan, did you want to add something?
I just actually wanted to sort of add a +1 to Dunstan, and I guess here with the caveat that this is my role. I'm the company engagement lead at RDR, and so we have a lot of conversations sort of one-on-one with the companies, and that those conversations, sort of the one of the overarching conclusions from those conversations is that there is just an enormous variety of sort of levels of knowledge, right, among the companies. And I think it's important to highlight here that we, as RDR, we have a sort of global coverage of companies, and not that there are, specific regional trends, but we do get questions from, some companies about, what is human rights due diligence? What should we publish to comply with this kind of expectation? How is it related to things like slavery and conflict minerals? Those are literally questions that we've gotten from companies in recent conversations, despite the fact that we as an organization prominently expose the fact that we focus squarely on freedom of expression and information, and privacy and non-discrimination to an extent. So I think the overarching sort of point is that either limiting or addressing those the imbalance of knowledge and information among companies internally, even in sort of these individual conversations, is a sort of I think under not to say under celebrated, but perhaps underappreciated maybe vector of influence, especially among people who are actual decision makers within the company.
Yeah, it's really fascinating stuff, and I think potentially very valuable areas of further research as well. Which I look at our participation room, and I'm sure they'll. My hope is that folks will dig into that. We have one raised hand, which I think we do have time for a question. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah. Hi. Thank you everyone for doing the talk. I really enjoyed it, and I thought it was really very enlightening and a lot of things I learned. The question I had was also regarding more of the implementation aspect. Through the talk, you guys have mentioned several kind of changes. Like Dunstan, you mentioned the researchizing of like focusing on long-term more than short-term, and then a lot of suggestions in the paper, and also like examples of adopting higher standards of regulation and whatnot. But I'm curious because in a lot of examples that we see now of companies where such adoptions were successful, it's most often spearheaded by one or two top heads or the leaders of the company, and the execution is very top-down implementation and like decisions. So if we want to change a company and make them adopt new policies and regulation, would you guys say that what needs to happen is the convincing of these one or two top executives in the company, or is it possible, do you think, that it's done more institutionally with a more bottom-up approach? I'm coming from a place where I will be an individual who will be entering a tech field, and this is something that I care a lot about, and I'm really curious and a little bit hopeful. So that's like the background for asking this question.
Yeah, I think it ties in a very interesting way to the previous discussion about employees and the role of internal champions. I don't know if Dunstan or others. Sorry, did you want to go there?
It's a tremendous question. I think the answer is all of the above. I think the ideal situation is we have committed leaders driving change, and all sorts of things that are driven by those that are closer to the front line, so to speak. And it's the combination of those two that are needed. I have certainly seen companies make significant progress without senior level buy-in and leadership. However, it is not as effective as situations where that leadership does exist. And going back to the discussion we had on board level expertise, I think that's one of the reasons why that is essential, that regardless of what duties a board has, I want to see board members and the C-suite have among its membership those that have expertise in human rights, because then it really is present in the decision-making discussions. And that's a work in progress.
And I know we have 2 minutes left, so I'll also try to be concise. And again, tremendous question, I agree. The only sort of substantive thing I would add is that I think, yes, it's definitely all of the above, as Dunstan says. I think there's also an element of sort of like a scaffolding element, right? So there are, as Dunstan mentioned, there are internal champions at every single one of these companies. And there's no doubt that there are people with very positive intentions. I feel in a way it's like a again, given the sort of experience that RDR has had, especially, it is a question of sort of convincing some of the people who are a little bit lower sort of on the rungs of the ladder, and ensuring that sort of works together with sort of top level company strategy, right? So we've had companies that have sort of committed to ESG as a sort of baseline or a foundation of their strategy at the very top level. And at the same time, sort of, we've been working as an organization with individuals that are responsible for, again, responsible investment or ethics within the company to drive the same kind of changes from not necessarily the very bottom, but from the middle, right? So essentially, it's the two things, and convincing the people that you directly talk to that have direct access to CEOs and other sort of upper level executives. That is, I think, a very important part of the conversation. So it's a stepwise kind of process in the end.
Sound advice. So we're just about at time. I'll offer my thanks to both of our panelists. I think this was a really fascinating conversation. I very much enjoyed it. And I think it's an excellent paper as well. And I think that the paper offers a very important contribution to this discourse. And hopefully these are ideas that are going to be taken forward in debates around corporate regulation and platform regulation going forward. So thank you again to Dunstan. Thank you again to Jan. Thank you to Elizabeth as well. And for those of you who are interested, please do check out the paper series and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Michael. And Dunstan, thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Great to see you again. Take care. Have a good weekend.